23rd of September 2007. Flight 394 had just taken off from Faro, Portugal, carrying 132 passengers, 5 crew members. Their destination? Bournemouth, on England's south coast, just 2.5 hours away. The engines roared and the Boeing 737 lifted into the air. With clear weather and no turbulence, it was a pretty smooth flight, to be honest. But within just a couple of hours, the plane would face an unthinkable fate. Stalling mid-air and then falling freely, showing all the signs of an impending crash. So how did a smooth flight change into such a disaster? What went wrong? And most importantly, did the crash happen? Did the passengers make it out alive or not? This is the shocking story of Thompson Fly Flight 3894, a tale so nerve-wracking it'll grip you tighter the closer you get to the end. The plane they were flying was no shiny new jet. It was 12 years old, an older version of the 737 series. Inside the cockpit, the screens weren't modern glass displays. It was a mix of old-school dials and chunky CRT screens, like the ones you'd find in a 90s computer. But it worked fine, and it was legal as well. Up front, the 56-years-old captain was experienced with more than 11,000 flying hours, but almost all of that was on different planes. On the 737, he only had 400 hours, and so technically he was still learning its tricks and turns. And next to him sat the first officer, 30 years old. He was flying the plane that night. Most of his flying life had been on small propeller planes like the Dash 8. Jets were still new to him, but his plus point was that he had about 800 hours on the 737, which was decent, and more than the captain, of course, but not seasoned enough. However, they still made a skilled team just new to this aircraft. And in aviation, that matters more than you can imagine. As the plane took off, things looked smooth, but far up north, things were different. The weather in Bournemouth was a mess. The wind was gusty, but that still wasn't the real problem. It was the clouds, which were so thick and low-hanging that it was like a fog blanketed the whole airport. The pilots couldn't see the runway until they were just 400 feet above the ground, barely 30 seconds from landing. That's tight timing and altitude, but still within legal limits. The good part was, since the captain was experienced, he made a smart call before takeoff. He asked for extra fuel. So at the time of landing, they had enough fuel for 2 landing attempts, including a go-around. But while they resolved one problem in advance, another problem was already cooked up in their hindsight. What they didn't know was that the runway waiting for them in Bournemouth was not safe for them to land, because something had gone terribly wrong down there. And to worsen the matter, once they started descending, there would be no turning back either. Since no one was aware of what was happening, the plane kept descending, straight into danger. Just 20 seconds later, the engines had pulled back to idle, just like they should in the landing procedure. But the speed? It wasn't dropping fast enough, but the plane was still coming in too fast. Outside the windows, nothing was visible except thick clouds. The only good thing, inside the cockpit, everything looked normal. No alarms, no flashing lights. But that would also change soon. Less than 7 miles from the airport, 2,000 feet in the air, and still buried in clouds, the first officer asked for flap 30. But the plane still remained quite fast. The instrument landing system guided them straight down the glide slope, like a track built into thin air. In clear skies, you'd see the runway lights miles ahead. But that night, they'd only appear at the last second, 400 feet above the ground. But at this point, the numbers on the screens weren't lining up. The flaps were fully out at 40 degrees, which was the maximum drag. The wheels were down. Thrust was at idle. The pilots had used every trick in the book to slow the plane down. But the jet kept slicing through the air like a speeding bullet, way too fast for a smooth touchdown. Meanwhile, in the cabin, passengers relaxed in their seats, reading, sleeping, chatting. Some didn't even know the plane had started descending. No one realized they were stepping into something that would leave just one question. Would they make it out alive or not? Back in the cockpit, the first officer adjusted the airspeed target again, but it made no change. Even the auto-throttle system, which was supposed to adjust engine power automatically, didn't work at all. Meanwhile, they were literally racing against time. It was just 5 miles out, and they were locked onto the runway path. The ground was getting closer with every passing second. Still, speed was holding steady and fast. At 3 miles out, while the plane was at 1,000 feet, what they saw was terrible. There was no runway in sight. Everything was still wrapped in clouds. The first officer's hands were still steady on the controls, eyes locked on the instruments. But the airplane wasn't behaving as expected. They thought in less than 30 seconds the plane would burst through the clouds, and perhaps the thing would be okay then. But when it did, What the pilots saw would turn routine into disaster. First, a green light blinked out, followed by an urgent red light, and while the pilots glanced at the panel, they missed another vital point. The auto-throttle had quietly disconnected. That meant the engine stayed idle, and as a result, the plane kept descending, losing speed. But the autopilot masked the danger, holding the glide path steady, like a lighthouse guiding a ship through fog. When the speed reached below 150 knots, the first officer called "Flaps 25" for more lift and more drag. To balance it, the autopilot nudged the nose up using the horizontal stabilizer. It's a routine process called trimming. Naturally, to the pilots, Flight 3894 looked perfectly on track. But they still didn't know that the thrust was gone and the plane was simply gliding without any power, like a car rolling downhill in neutral. The first officer requested to extend the flaps to 40 degrees, even though the plane was flying too fast for that setting. The captain reached for the lever, and at that exact moment, the first officer set the target landing speed, 135 knots, thinking the combination of the flaps and the auto-throttle would tackle it now. But that never happened. Because remember, the auto-throttle was already dead. Instead, the aircraft's speed kept dropping 135 knots, 130, 125. Suddenly, the captain shouted, "Speed!" In a fraction of a second, the first officer pushed the throttles in reflex, but only a little, which was not enough to start the engine. So the captain grabbed the levers, slammed them forward, and commanded, "Go around! Flap 15, check thrust!" It was a desperate call to abort the landing and climb away. But here came another set of problems. At low speed, maximum power comes with some consequences. Boeing had already warned, don't apply full thrust at very low speeds. The reason? The sudden burst of engine power can unbalance the aircraft in midair. Naturally, this flight now officially dipped into danger. At 110 knots, the stick shaker activated, shaking the control column violently. That's the plane's loudest warning, and to every pilot, it signals a nightmare. They're about to stall. Meanwhile, outside, the ground was just 1,500 feet below. It meant there was almost no room left to recover now. At this moment, the captain made one last desperate attempt to avoid the disaster. He pointed the plane downward to increase the plane's speed, helping air flow smoothly over the wings again. Eventually, it lifted the plane again, stopped the stall, and let the plane fly normally. Besides, the engines also roared to life, reaching 80% power. But also, two new problems had taken over. One, time was running out. And two, which was even more dangerous, the plane again shot up like a skyrocket. Even the passenger in the cabin felt a sudden violent jerk. Because up in the cockpit, the captain had pushed the throttle all the way forward for a go-around. It's usually safe, but in a Boeing 737, going around with a full power can be risky because its engines are placed below its center of gravity. So whenever they blast at full power, the nose doesn't just go forward, it jerks up. So the captain had to push the controls forward to stop the climb. But shockingly, the plane kept climbing and the speed again dropped quickly. The small control surfaces at the back, which are called elevators, couldn't fight the power of the engines and make the plane align with the glide path. To put it simply, it was like trying to hold down a balloon with a string in a heavy storm. And then again came the noise no pilot ever wants to hear, the loud vibration of a stick shaker. Once again, the plane was about to stall while they were still just a couple thousand feet above the ground. At first, the jet shook violently, and for a second it calmed down and the vibration stopped. But in aviation, moments of calm often hide the next storm. The first officer retracted the flaps to 15 degrees, as the checklist said. But that small move caused the nose to tilt up again. And then came mistake number 2. What happened now was totally ridiculous, especially in this life-threatening situation. One of the pilots at this crucial time stepped on the rudder by mistake. The rudder is what controls the plane's side-to-side movement, helping it turns left or right. Naturally, the plane rolled left suddenly and the vibration returned with another stall warning. Both the pilots tried to align the plane by taking the nose down using full force, but the elevators weren't strong enough. And this is where it truly went out of control. The plane climbed even more, now tilted over 36 degrees. Wings tilted 22 degrees left, just 2,000 feet above the ground. To fix it, the captain kicked the right rudder. But instead of steadying, the nose shot up at 44 degrees and both control sticks began to shake violently. The plane was climbing steep, nearly sideways, and running out of air. And then, finally, it started to stall for real. At 2,500 feet, the wings of Flight 3894 stopped producing lift, and the plane simply started falling. The angle of attack, which means how much the plane's wing is tilted upward, kept rising. The wings were tilted so far, air hit them from underneath. That's not how planes fly, that's exactly how they crash. Airspeed stopped to 82 knots. For a 737 that's barely flying, it's sinking. They were seconds away from hitting the ground, and the captain had one move left. He pulled the thrust back to 8.6%. This was nothing but a gamble. And the result? It worked. The nose came down by 15 degrees in 2 seconds. The wings started generating lift again, helping the plane regain control, and the captain eased the nose up to 5 degrees. Miraculously, the jet came back alive into the sky with flaps up, gear in, and altitude rising to 4,000 feet. In the cabin, no one knew they'd just dodged a lethal disaster. The first officer called for a go-around. They'd try landing again. In the back, passengers glanced out the windows. Maybe confused, maybe annoyed. Some tightened seatbelts, but something still didn't add up. Why did the plane stall in the first place? The captain had added extra fuel before departure. It was a safe call, but now another problem has surfaced. The first officer finally spotted it. The auto-throttle had disconnected, mid-approach, and no one had noticed. On this older 737 Classic, the auto-throttle had a known glitch, one failure every couple hundred flights. But this one struck at the worst time, final approach. There was an alert for this too, but it was just a subtle cue on a cluttered display with no sound, no warning light. Speed dropped away slowly until lift vanished and the stall hit. But during the investigation, investigators blamed Boeing and the FAA. They pushed for louder alerts, clearer warnings, and smarter systems. To Boeing's credit, newer 737s like the NG and MAX fixed this. But you know, even the best tech has limits, so it still comes down to the crew. Ironically, the captain didn't break any rules by increasing thrust. His airline, Thompson Fly, never warned about adjusting the plane's nose angle, but Boeing's manual did. So you see, that gap in guidance made the situation worse. By sheer luck, at 11:01 at night, Flight 3894 finally touched down in Bournemouth safely. All the passengers came out safe as they only felt a bump and a jerk. But no one knew how close they'd come to death. But in aviation circles, it brought real changes like better training, tighter SOPs, more vigilant crews, and yet one mystery still remains. Why didn't anyone catch the falling airspeed until it was nearly too late? And if pilots who are trained, focused, experienced could miss something that small, how many other flights are just one unnoticed glitch away from disaster? And what happens when luck doesn't show up next time? Let us know your thoughts in the comment below, and if this left you breathless, hit like, subscribe, and share. Because next time, the skies might not be so forgiving.